Very well, let's get ready to start. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming out. This is Professor Nelson, and he's
Nice to meet
continuing the
you.
class with me, the
Oh, great.
studio. And these are three of our PhD students
Nice.
in the
Great to
school.
meet
I'm very glad that you decided to come. This will be phenomenal. And Elena Tudela is our distinguished international guest, spending some days with us in the school with both the architecture program and the planning program. She's an associate professor of architecture in the Universidad Nacional de UNAM, and she's also one of the four partners of Oficina de Resiliencia Urbana, Urban Office, which is a firm that works on all the spectrum of design from architectural to urban design to regional and even ex-urban, urban, all the range of design. So she'll show us a little bit of that. And I think it will be quite particularly pertinent to what we're doing in studio, as she's going to be speaking a little bit about community engagement, also like how we go about it. Thank you very much, Elena.
Thank you, Clara. Thank you all for being here. It's nice to meet you. So I'll be talking about collective. Can you hear me back there? Is it okay? I don't need a microphone, do I? That's fine back there. You do? Okay, I'll turn it on. No problem. Okay, wait. Can you hear me now? Oh. No? There you go. Okay. Now you can hear me. Okay. Well, the talk I'll be giving today is named Collective and Resilient Processes in Urban Environmental Planning. And I'm going to go over some of the projects I showed yesterday, but more from a community engagement perspective. And I added another series of projects that might be interesting to you in terms of like more about the planning aspect of our work. So I divided the presentation in three topics, and the first one has to do with planning of teams and urban processes, since for us, design is not only about the objects, but also about the processes and how do we set the table for design, and that becomes part of our process as well. And so to begin with, I'd like to talk to you about some references we studied and we worked with. This is Resilient by Design. Rebuild by Design initiative. I don't know if you heard about it. There was a follow-up of this initiative called Resilience by Design in the San Francisco Bay Area. But this one, Rebuild by Design, started with Hurricane Sandy in New York. And they did a number of actions that had to do with, I think it was 11 projects, if I'm not mistaken, by different studios in the US. And they did this very interesting stakeholder map where you can see sort of like the whole ecosystem of people participating in this initiative. And we like it because it's very clear in terms of who relates to what, to where, and to different phases of the project. For instance, we get to see the leadership over here, the strategic guidance, which are the studios. Then we have international talent, with sort of like helps or aid contributed to making it technically feasible. And then we have the 10 projects and the local state government, the community coalition partners, and then a whole of other offices, sort of like New Jersey's governor's office for recovery and building, etc. So we felt that it's very relevant to start a project understanding who's seated at the table. And then they went on to design the process itself. So it becomes not just a plan, but a whole process. And this makes a whole difference. Recently, I was talking to the city of Houston. They've been trying to do these resilience hubs in different public utility buildings. And they were saying that they could never finish the master plans. They could never finish the plans for their work. And when they heard the idea about this design of a process rather than a static plan, their whole strategy changed. And they said, yeah, we need a live document, not something that's printed out and then it becomes outdated the next day. And so we believe that's something we can learn also from the same initiative, Rebuild by Design. And you can see here how they devise the process in 4 different stages. Talent, so the people participating in it, research, design, and then implementation, and how those sort of like connect, interact, and how that becomes a whole process. There are other ways of understanding design processes in the urban realm, sort of like one of these is the design thinking process, which oscillates between divergent and convergent thinking modes, which you can see here. So you can match the design phase with different ideation modes. So for instance, they divided in discovery, interpretation, ideation, experimentation, and evolution. And they exemplify it by very simple phrases, sort of like, I have a challenge, how do I approach it? I learned something, how do I interpret it? I see an opportunity, what do I create? I have an idea, how do I build it? I tried something new, how do I evolve it? And this has to do with a couple of steps: understand the challenge, prepare research, gather inspiration. And this oscillation has to do with the number of possibilities. So sometimes they increase and sometimes they decrease. And so you know where your efforts are at, depending on the moment you're in. There's also tell stories, sort of like the narrative of a project, search for meaning, frame opportunities, generate ideas, refine ideas, prototype, get feedback, track learnings, and move forward. So in a way, these are all different types of understanding processes in designing for the urban, which you might find useful. This is a drawing of our own. So at Oru, we just recently did this Sankey diagram to understand what each member of our team is working on and how, like, to know how to manage our time for each project, and also how much projects we can take as an office. So these types of diagrams we discuss and review on a weekly basis at our management meetings. And it became very clear for us once we saw it that I'm very busy, that I can't take any more projects, for instance, or, some of us are really busy and some of us can take a couple of other types of projects. So it just helps visualizing these type of management. Yesterday at the conference, at the lecture, I showed this image in terms of like trying to pinpoint what a complete process of urban intervention should go through. And so these are the different phases: shared vision and preliminary studies, where, a lot of it goes into it. These are some of those studies into it, like build the vision, data gathering, preliminary technical studies for an integrated diagnosis or assessment, resilience analysis of mapping of urban, environmental, and social dynamics. But then we have the urban strategy and schematic design, where we talk about the urban strategy, the public participation and the engagement, the schematic conceptual design, most of the time being co-created by the different stakeholders. But also you start talking about the financial and maintenance plan that comes at the same moment than the conceptual design. Therefore, you're designing, thinking along those lines. Then we have the design, development, and construction documents, which is having then the very specific preliminary technical studies, a communication strategy, design, development, and construction. Then there's like the process for public bidding, if applicable, which in the urban most likely will be. And then the construction or implementation, the monitoring, project evaluation, and learning from it. So it's sort of like visualizing where we stand at each project, which parts we need to be involved in, and where we need to find someone to collaborate with and design the team as well. So this becomes sort of like the blueprint for the team configuration. We also design, these are the processes that have to do with methodologies that give shape and order to these processes. So this is ours. up to now. We have worked on it and keep redesigning it as we learn from experience. And in this last iteration, we feel there is a circular relationship between different phases of design. We call it coding, comprehensive design and implementation mechanism. And for us, it's very relevant to understand exactly what we're doing when and when to go back to something, because it's never linear. Sometimes you go back from the vision to the design or the implementation to the strategy, which makes you also, I was discussing this with Clara earlier during lunch, the relevance of being able to adapt to different situations that you might not control, and you almost always never control. So you have to be ready for it, but without feeling completely helpless. It's okay to lose control of the process if you know what can happen and where you can go back to the point you need to be. So in a way, these types of diagrams have contributed to us feeling safer about like uncertainty and also being able to adapt to changes that are outside of our purview. Then we have different types of diagrams we've also built over time with a lot of collaborators. This, for instance, this methodology of an assessment we devised when we were doing the Bogota's environmental circuit for the city government. And we sat down with all of the collaborators who were designing the project, some local, us being international, but also some technical stakeholders from the city. We came up with something similar to this, which we've, in a way, been retrofitting all the time. And it sort of helped out just to understand how to make interventions for the urban in a way that's very clear what needs to be connected with what. So we have like an agenda definition. So the shared vision that I talked about before has to do with participation strategies, work plan detail. We need to find out like commitments between with stakeholders, deliverables, the schedules, then who is compiling the data and what are the sources, the reliable or the possibilities for that data, and where do they come from, who gets them. Then an urban environmental inventory. So what's happening in terms of ecosystem services, the hierarchization of relevant ecosystems. So it's not just identifying them, but prioritizing them. And then what is the social cultural value, economic value, current state of preservation, the pressure level, and urban environmental integration conflict, which need to be obviously discussed. And then we have the territorial analysis and characterization, which has to do with 4 aspects. This is something we've changed a long time, but we feel these are 4 categories that can mix really well. And so we have environmental aspects, which we have a longer list, but this is a synthesis. Social demographic aspects, aspects of urban infrastructure, and aspects of risk and vulnerability. Then we move on to the main findings. So stakeholder mapping, we have to identify main problems, management scopes, presence of stakeholders in groups in the territory, what's happening, so current projects, and possible opportunities. And then we have the selection of strategic areas for urban environmental dynamics. So where would we want to work in? And then we move on to a preliminary portfolio of actions. This also goes back to programming and consideration of what's already happening in the territory, to then move on to a prioritization. And we, for each of these stages, we have like a protocol and a couple of diagrams that help us provide to the group that's discussing them, so that we can come up with a detail of these priority actions and what are the implementation, so scale, scopes, and implementation recommendations for all of the stakeholders. What are the co-financing scenarios, and what are the incorporation of development agendas and management plans? So this becomes sort of like, in the end, a systematization of the methodology. So in a way, this helps us not be all over the place. And when uncertainty kicks in, which is almost always, how do we get back to this map? And now I'm going to talk a little bit about some projects to exemplify these ideas. First one is one that I talked about yesterday, the Neighborhood Community Resilience Plan, Miravalle Cultural Forum Water Pilot Project, which is a project we're doing with Resilient Cities Catalyst. And also like the community, which is called the Asamblea Comunitaria Miravalle, which is in this circle here. This is the area. As I mentioned yesterday, this is like the poorest and more marginalized area within Mexico City, not of the metropolitan area. The metropolitan area is way worse. But within, the limits of the city, this is the area that's more abandoned, marginalized, denser, without services, etc. But they have something very unique, which is they're next to this conservation land that has a lot of aptitude for water infiltration, and 70% of the water in Mexico City comes from the underground. So it becomes very relevant that people do not keep, urbanizing these areas because we depend on them for the water. So they become sort of like the guardians of this space, these types of communities. And I'm talking about a community that's well known for its self-organization. They've been running Miravalle for 30 years now. As I mentioned yesterday, it's around 15,000 people in this community. And it's amazing working with them because it's not easy to work with communities that are unorganized. And with them, everything works much better and discussions move along very fast just because they work together. And working together, I'm learning a lot from them because working together means sometimes losing your political views. Instead of thinking we all need to think the same in terms of, parties and political aspects, here they say, let's not bring that, to the table, which I think is very smart. And there are a lot of things that they do that they've learned out of experience, out of 30 years of self-organization, that has allowed them to build a lot of infrastructure for themselves. Here's what I was mentioning. This is the Sierra de Santa Catarina. They're located right here. The red spots are the illegal settlements on conservation land. So you can see that what they do helps a lot to stop these illegal settlements from growing. And then in blue, you see how much this territory infiltrates water. So even if you see it as something that has no forests, almost no vegetation, it doesn't mean that they're not providing a very relevant ecosystem services. So we need to understand that, and for the community to know that their territory is not worth nothing. It's worth a lot, but you need to have that information to understand that if you stop urbanization from expanding there, you have something to sit with the government and negotiate and say, okay, I'll help you, but help me, provide me with certain services. So that's empowering for a community, and that's the way we're helping them understand that relationship to the territory. This is part of the community. These are some of the meetings. A community that also receives a lot of international residential artistic residences. So a lot of German artists go there. And so the community is very culturally rich, which is something very relevant to them. This is like the main community, how do you say, comedor? Dining room, restaurant, hall. It's not a restaurant, but they charge 50 cents of a dollar for a meal, and they produce 300 meals a day for all of these people that have no other way of eating. And it's fantastic, actually. And this is part of the project we're bringing to them. We're helping them renovate their water catchment system, and providing like a recreative area for children, like a fountain where you bike and the pumps are activated. So you can see where water comes from, and you get a better consciousness of what, the water culture that is in place here. These are, the water catchment like blocks where water is filtered, and so they have done murals on them, etc. Then we also did with the community this assessment, participatory assessment of the area, where they were mapping for the first time even bullying activities. Like bullying, they decided what they wanted to map, and we helped them out, and we we put it together with what the cartography said, so that enriched their assessment. They could finally see all of that data that's not accessible to them in a same map, but also adding their own perception and their own knowledge of the territory. So this map became very relevant for them to understand and to also make plans for the future. This is the Sierra de Santa Catarina. This is, the context. Once all of this was illegal settlements, and now as any slum, you would say, but now it's very formal. And it has become one of the largest alcaldías counties of the city. And actually, the new mayor of Mexico City lives right around the corner of this community. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But there's a lot of learnings, lessons that come from this territory, sort of like where sidewalks are not sidewalks. So whenever we talk about sidewalks in Miravalle or in Iztapalapa, they're used as storage, they're used to plant trees, they're used for different uses, but not particularly for humans and accessibility. And that's just the way it is. They also use speed bumps to conduct water, so that water goes to where they want to instead of flooding downstream. And then there's also other types of activities that relate to the Tetlalmanche, which is a volcano nearby. And they do movie festivals, cinema festivals, to portray ideas of how cities relate to their volcanoes or their geographical attributes, which is very interesting. Also, the murals that you see talk about the past of these communities. So they came from other towns that are not Mexico City. They immigrated, 40, 50 years ago. And so they bring their own culture here to remind the community where they're from. This is the woman in charge of the 300 meals a day. And then, they also take advantage of every opportunity they have for, their livelihood, such as selling things in the street or providing services for others. They have a plastic recycling center where they build furniture, so they don't need to buy furniture. They get everything they need from their surroundings and from their strength, which is a community organization. And this is the volcano. So they gave us a tour of it, and it was very interesting the way they understand different species. They have a lot of knowledge of native species, of all of these animals that are, nobody knows about. Even their names sounds weird, but that used to be there in the basin. So they're even like this history witnesses. This is happening next weekend. This one, the next one, and it's the final opening of this pilot project. They decided they wanted to do T-shirts for all of the organizers, and we did the visual aids of it, and so it became a collaboration where we laid out the bridge for communities, politicians, but also some government entities, sort of like the Secretary of Risk of the city and the community. And then it's very interesting, this building that they did a while ago, they negotiated with the government to let one of the programs of the city that's called Pilares come into their community, because Pilares program comes with security, comes with a policeman or two. So they were willing to give away one of their cultural centers to this government program, because that allows them to have some security in the area. So they managed to say, okay, we're sharing this with the government, but we want to run it. And the government said, okay, you're running it, we're providing some things. And it's very interesting the way they mediate with, formality and informality. And this is the program, this is the way that the Pilares look elsewhere in the city. They're very famous architects doing them, Fernanda Canales, Rosana Montiel, Arquitectura 911, they're doing all of these very beautiful buildings, actually, with very small budgets. But this is the way Miravalle does Pilares, which is different. And I feel that there's a lot to be learned from that, from a top-down to a bottom-up perspective. And then this also feeds into one of the programs that is growing, because as I mentioned, the new mayor lives around here. And she promoted, while she was running Iztapalapa, the Utopias, which are these huge parks for very impoverished areas. And so now that she's running the whole city, Iztapalapa has more visibility, and these communities are actually excited about how they can benefit from having that political gain. I'm going to talk a little bit about another project that yeah, of course. So utopias are these public spaces that you can see some of them here, where they have nothing. There used to be just how do you say this? Tiraderos de basura, junkyards, and derelict spaces that not the mayor, the director of Iztapalapa decided to repurpose for cultural, for recreative purposes. So for instance, in an area where there's no water, she established, like, I think 10 different pools for people to swim in, which was so weird because they don't even have water in their houses, but they can go there, take a shower, swim, and go back home. And so that, I think that's what made her become soon our new mayor. This is a program that actually, made a difference, and everyone started turning to Iztapalapa for the first time. This is a very, as I said, the poorest area, and it has these sizes of buildings because they settled in an area where the land was very cheap, obviously, and so from jails to the largest market in the world is there, the Central de Abastos, which is the way Mexico City gets its food from, is in Iztapalapa. We have everything we don't want near the city, right in Iztapalapa. So there's a lot of lots that are abandoned, that are right there, and she made that she turned it into an opportunity for this community. So this program that we're working on will get some visibility. We just send the invitations to the event. Usually nobody goes. It's very far. You have to go up. We even said, we have a van to take you if you're interested. And for the first time, we had 30 people interested in going for the first time ever. So there's a lot of eyes right now in this very marginalized area of the city. And talking about another project, that's the medium-scale hydric district model, the case of Tacubaya, which is now to the western side of the city. This is the evolution of the city while it was a lake city. You can see how the lakes disappeared completely over time. It had 48 rivers and 5 lakes to nothing, and it became a linear model. Now it's a linear model of water extraction and exploitation instead of infiltration and a more sustainable management of the water we have. This is how crazy it gets. Our water comes from over here. This in white is the limitation of the city. This is Iztapalapa. And so we bring water, 22% of our water comes from really far away at very high cost, social, economic, all the costs you want. You have to pump it up 1,000 meters up because there's this mound here. So you need to pump it a lot and then get it into the city. And then the leaks of the infrastructure account for 40% of our supply of water. So we do all of that effort just to have them being leaked. Some people say, hey, well, maybe that's going to the aquifer. Maybe that's a good thing, except that sometimes it gets mixed with other types of leaks, which becomes an issue. But then all of our sewage system goes out to the Mezquital Valley, which is this different basin where it's very interesting because it's the territory in the world that has received more sewage ever. So it has been receiving sewage for more than 60 years now. And there's some very interesting lessons learned from that, because when water seeps through that territory, somehow it gets cleaned at, maybe 60 meters, 100 meters below our feet. And so, there's all of these geological interesting relationships. But, when you talk about Mexico City, we don't usually talk about the whole system. And that's something that people don't usually know, and helps to show that. From my experience and our experience at Oru, communities want to know what their role is in the larger city. So whenever they see it, they get excited to know that their problems are not unique, that the whole city is struggling, and that what they do can make a difference. But you have to show it to them. Otherwise, it just by saying it's not enough. You need to make it visible. I'm not going to go deep into the model. The model tries to switch or to shift away from the usual model of give me water, but a building asks from the city, and I'll give you my sewage, and that's that, to a model where you decentralize and you provide the water. So what kind of water you can produce as a building, and the city can help manage that water collectively, not only between stakeholders, but also between buildings. So if you're like a gym and you need gray water, not necessarily drinking water, for certain parts of your operations, 70% of the wastewater of a residential area is gray water. So it's just trying to come up with a system where topographically, where you have to pump less, so you need less energy, but also how you need, like you demand certain qualities of water, and some others provide different qualities of water. So it's coming up with like a collective, like a strategy, an intelligence, that allows to disconnect as much as possible from the centralized water board, because there's no more water to offer. And whenever a building gets developed in a city like ours, everyone complains, like they can even stop the project because they know it. We all know it. So if there's a building, you have less water, you'll get less water, and you'll run out of it at some points of the week. So they're not willing to accept any more development unless you have these strategies, and these strategies have to be visible, and that's what this model of hydric districts is about. But in order to do that, we did go through an analysis of the whole micro basin. So you have to understand, like whenever you're doing a project, what's your minimum analysis scale? And for us, it was this, where the river runs through it. This is our district, the pink one. This is the history. We always analyze the history of where they've been, where we've been, because it's always an evolution. You can't stop history and then just change things. You need to understand what the tendencies are and where we're going. And then the political. Nothing happens if there's no political will behind it. This is the current mayor, for now future president of our country, talking about this project in Tacubaya. We had to do a stakeholder map, also understanding academia, social organizations, unique citizens, private, public, institutional, heritage institutions, and who are they, how are they related between each other, and then do it in an academic institution, because then that gives it partiality. So people are, building trust, and universities are naturally places where people trust each other. So we did that at UNAM with neighbors, developers, government, and having the table being set by the national university, and that helped the conversation. So even understanding where to have the meetings becomes very relevant to a project, even if it's not within the space, where the interventions are taking place. This is the map of the 10 projects that we collectively came up with at this several days workshop, and then how like 3 different narratives, drive the 10 projects, and how they relate between each other. This is the map of where they're laid out, where we're recycling water, where we're treating it, where we're just stopping it from runoff. And these are the projects and the three narratives that I told you about. Reveal history because of the relevance, the historic relevance of this area. Consolidate and expand green space system, but not just as an action where you see like the green stroke of greenwashing, but understanding what type of species, how much water they need, where does that water, where will it come from, who will provide it, with what periodicity, etc. So it's understanding it at a more technical and deep level, and then understanding water as a resource, not as a waste, where you treat it, store it, capture it, reuse it as much as possible so that each drop of water that falls into this territory stays there as much as possible, instead of the model, the current model, which goes all the way to Valle del Mezquital, to irrigate crop fields there. The second part has to do with planning and public policy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this project, BioCities Coastal Adaptation Initiative, which was a project we did last year for the German Collaboration Agency in Mexico, where the question that they were, laying out was, how can we do tourism without confronting it with ecosystems and ecosystem services? Currently, they're not related. They don't care about each other. They act as if one needs the other one, but they're not talking. There's not a dialogue. So we did it for 3 different areas of the country: Los Cabos, Boca del Río in Veracruz, and Bacalar and Oton Blanco, Pe Blanco. These are some of those contexts. As you can see, this is what usually happens. They just devastate all of the tropical forest, and that's that. So we did a planning process where we identified those conflicts initially. So for each of the 3 areas, like, what are the ecosystems, what are the natural risks, and what are the urban pressures, to understand what's related to what. We went to talk to them to understand their problems firsthand and to come up with a map of all of the challenges that are, taking place in this territory in a collective manner. And then we did our analysis that I just showed you, the ecological and environmental aspects, the urban, the risks one, the socioeconomical. And then we identified those projects and green infrastructure projects that are currently taking place in the area, and also where do the opportunities to improve those or increase them could take place. And these are the results of those workshops and those discussions of where should investment go. That's what the government was asking. Where should we invest that can become successful? And you have to come up with an argument for that, and you have to come up with a solution that they can implement in the future, and that can be incorporated into their public policy strategy. So a lot of these went into, we had to go to meetings in terms of their planning boards, and see how much of this is relevant to their program so that they could incorporate them and then become feasible, become implementable. This is the characterization phase that we did, where more economic units were concentrated, where the risk by flood lies, etc. Then we went to the site and understand the specific challenges that have to do with a more urban design level. And then we came up with a catalog of solutions that have to do with green infrastructure that they could implement in different places, also integrating them to the gray infrastructure. And then we come up with ideas for solutions where these were visible, where people could understand what they're doing to these ecosystem services and why these, biofilters exist, or any of the other solutions. This is part of those strategies. For instance, all of the parking spots had grass below them, like a very tough special grass that helps water to infiltrate, so that water goes to the spaces. So the spaces that are used for parking and not just for cars are also for storing water. And these are some of the strategies that we were trying to test here for each of the projects. And we came up with a multi-criteria matrix that we devised collectively, where each of the projects was evaluated in terms of like these 7 types of categories, so that it would give you a final number that you can say, okay, this makes more sense to do first. This would be more, impactful if we do it, and in what way, so that it becomes sort of like a tool for decision makers instead of like a very rigid solution. This is what you should do. This is a tool for you to decide what you want to do, but these are, the implications of those decisions. And then we came up with this, which, came from a need of the government that actually went into one of the public policy documents. That is what to do if you want to do green infrastructure. What should I do? And so, do you have a site, a specific site? Yes or no? If you do, do you have like an assessment? Yes or no? In what stage of the design it is in? And then, you knew how to move around the possibilities and what you needed to ask from different stakeholders to make it happen. So it became like a very relevant tool, and it's part of the design as well. And then you had to go through this matrix of assessment and prioritization of projects where we did meetings with all of them, with a group of people from the communities, and then starting to understand it's not only what you can find from databases, but also what people know about the territory. So this was a mechanism that we used to get that information from different communities. And then we came up with a stakeholder map I thought it was really interesting because you could also understand the influence of each stakeholder and the capacity that they have to make changes in the territory. So you also know a little bit of, the weight, not always the weight you want, but the perceived weight of each stakeholder. So you can also balance things out. So it gives you information, and making it visible became very relevant. Finally, we did this like scoreboard so that they can get finances. So this board has the exact information that most grants, that the government can tap into requires. So we ended up having all of the information laid out so that they can also present it to get financial support to build them. The next project has to do with this book we built with the Secretary of Integrated Risk Management and Civil Protection. That's called Resilient Mexico City, Prospective and Projection of an Invulnerable City. And I'm just gonna go through this because it became like a narrative we built with the government that later became very relevant to other documents such as like the Risk Atlas or, different protocols for risk in the city. So we did an analysis of 2 of the most relevant risks in the city, earthquakes and floods. And this is the story of it, but you had to make it visual. So the secretary already knew all of this, but not having it in a single place laid out and synthesized was hindering all of this process that had to do with risk and resilience. And so we made it visible. It's free to download. Anyone can download it online. And these are all of the aspects that I already talked about. And a synthesis map that showed all of the vulnerabilities of Mexico City. Sometimes people do not know where the lake used to be unless there's an earthquake, and then you can see the cracks from what used to be a lake, from the transition zone, from the mountains. And so knowing that allows you to, when you do an intervention in the territory, you can mark it. You can see it. There's ways that you can make all of these processes visible, and that becomes more resilient. This used to be the lake. This used to be the rivers, so people see it. And then we did a whole history of the floods. Like you can see, 1382 is the first recollection of a flood, but we did it for, all of the timeline. We did a map that showed where the city was and all of its infrastructures. We recollected information, visual information as well. And then when we had, like, again, earthquakes and floods all throughout the history of the city. We also started adding at some point land tenure to understand who owns the land, and then also where the infrastructures are going, and what's been done the last earthquake, 2017, and then 2018 and 19 from different floods. And I believe this was one of the drawings I enjoyed the best, because it proved that risk is socially constructed. It's devised. A lot of people say natural disasters. Maybe they're naturally sourced, but the risk is always socially constructed. So it also assumes a responsibility for the government, for the communities, and what you do with them, and how we've socially built the risk over time. So certain decisions have increased the risk of the city in certain directions. So that helps a lot when planning in the future. These are all of the floods, how much they cost, what was destroyed, etc. So finally, to finish off, here are some very brief ideas of why cartography and visualization can be relevant to understanding strategic planning and policy and public policy in terms of the public realm. And just to make a couple of statements, like this is the Mercator projection, as you know. I don't if you use GIS, it's sort of like the usual map that we see. It's using the projection of Mercator, which is only real magnitude is the equator, which deforms particularly Africa, particularly other like Australia. Everything that's south of the equator gets deformed. So we end up having a reading of the world that's not actually, that's deformed. And so there's different maps that try to operate within different logics, sort of like Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion projection, which is much more equal. Like you can decide where to cut your map, and each map has different consequences. You won't do the same project if your world map looks like this than it does like this. So picking where to cut your maps makes a lot of sense. And then I like this idea that the same territory, if you map it one way, it leads to certain projects. But if you map a different aspect of it, then it leads to other types of projects. So observation becomes, don't just add layers to a map or to your drawings. Try to understand the consequences of drawing certain things within your analysis. Or even switching it around because the map demands it. Because if you cut it in certain areas, then you lose information. So try to understand what you're doing when you're doing these. The same that, Kevin Lynch did with the image of the city, where you don't see the lines except of the perceptual, perception of the space. This is how many people understand a certain area as a path, as an edge, as a node. And the darker the color, the more people that believe it is. So you can see how people see their own city. And this is just an invitation from Rania Gosson and El Hadi Jasairi that did this book that I find really interesting, Geostories and Other Architecture for the Environment, where they invite us to go beyond the poverty of geographic imagination, is what they call it, both spatially and visually. And they propose an architecture with externalities that brings into representation aesthetics and politics, those things, spaces and scales that are erased from the geographic imagination. And I believe, they talk about ocean acidification, deep sea mining, soil erosion, air pollution, freshwater storage, and carbon storage, but make it visible and make it compelling to a narrative. And finally, these are some images of a project we're working for Arizona, for Phoenix, that is going through a problem with heat. We also did this type of diagram to understand where we're at. And right now, we're before starting a participatory process and prioritization matrix to understand how to start thinking about the financing and monitoring, evaluation, and implementation. We did an analysis of its history as well, the Hohokam civilization to its foundation, the regional agricultural hub, all of the relationship it had with water initially as a settlement. its agricultural potential, then after World War II, a space of rebirth and opportunity, and then how it's been expanding as almost any city. It's the fifth largest city in the United States and home to almost 5 million people struggling with the impacts of heat. And so recognizing those collective efforts that are already taking place, but integrating them into one single effort or collective effort, and contemplating disenfranchised communities that are the ones most vulnerable to this phenomenon. And just to finish off, these are some of the maps that we developed and we presented to the community. And the community now, through just seeing at these maps, became very engaged. And now they want to join the initiative. It's called, what's the name of it? Somos? I'll remember in a second. They named the initiative, what was that again? It was something else. I'll remember. Oh, you did. Yeah, it's got like a tricky name, but so these are the maps we show them: the water bodies and extraction, the exposure and the unequal sensitivity, public space deserts where they don't have any land use, spaces of opportunity, and we're working with the Maricopa County now at El Oso Park, which is one of the points that are, more vulnerable to these types of risks, population density, vulnerability index. And they were sort of like enthralled to see all of this information, which they had no access to before, or didn't know how to relate to it. A future vision of the city, and then the criteria for projects qualification, which we have to go through to understand which projects makes most sense for this park that we'll be working for with the city. That's it. Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know if you have any questions before we leave.
Questions, comments? Yes.
I don't know. We don't the mic.
I think you do, because there's like a
Okay.
yeah. Is it on? Hello. No, maybe just like
To hear someone. Sorry about this.
maybe you can help us turn it on. Sorry.
I think
Yeah, it's
you
working.
can.
Okay.
Okay, so I felt like I don't know much about the political scenario of the Mexico. So it felt like I mean, it's more stable, like planners and the designers, they're working. I mean, what happens with the political unrest, or if the government changes or something, like what is the positionality of with planners, designers, with the leaderships, government leaderships? I wanted to because this kind of projects, it takes a long time to, and the
Oh.
funding, and yeah, it changes.
Yeah, it's a close and like love-hate relationship, I would say. Every day Mexico's like undergoing this phase where governments are finding us really useful, which wasn't the case like maybe 20, 30 years ago. And now they're believing public space has a special role in, in the city's evolution. And so that's a current phase. I started off with the Public Space Authority, which was in 2009. It opened up. It was the first time that, the government took over the task of producing public space, like with an intentionality, not only, like making it aesthetically nice or like maintaining it. And so the relationship changes obviously for political reasons, but I believe that once they set that tone, people are asking for more public space, and that becomes like a voters, a topic for voters, like decision making. And so it's interesting because now like the votes go to people to politicians who actually engage in public spaces and the public good, the welfare, I would say. So once that started, that has to do with architects, and now they're interested in getting prizes, like architectural prizes, and governments are like, oh, can we get more of those? We don't even know what are they, but it looks good on let's get some of those. And now we're competing. Some of the projects we did for the government are me as Crown Hall candidates, or and they're promoting it. The government has an agency that's like, hey, there's like a biennale, and there's like this prize here, and the Rosa Barba landscape one, and whatever they can find, because that becomes political, yeah, material, I would say. So right now it's okay, but you have to adapt to different situations.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Is there any other questions? No? All good? Yeah, of course. Oh, if you can.
Yeah, thank you. I guess that's on. Thank you for the presentation and the thoughtful insight. One of the things, I mean, specifically from the Phoenix example, it made me think of, many of the communities that either that the students are working in, or as a professional planner, we've been at, multiple times, and there are ways to understand like what has been done before. And I appreciated the, kind of that array of looking all the way back in history. But I wonder, just kind of observations from you in terms of, let's say Phoenix or somewhere else where there's already been lots of different, resilience planning that has been done, and how do you evaluate what to include, what to fold in, what to maybe dismiss potentially, because there's going to be time constraints, resource constraints. And I think maybe kind of going back to some of the models you have for assessment, it might help the students think about, like, as we're gathering information, as we're looking at what has been done before, or best examples or best practices from other communities, what are the processes that they or we should be going through to assess what to include, what to refer to, as we move forward? Because certainly there's going to be a variety of things that have been done before that might have a range of effectiveness, but we can't include it all. But we have to be mindful of what's been already done. So just some observations.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question as well, because it's not easy to, like, who gets to decide what gets tossed out and what gets done. We don't feel capable of saying that. Sometimes they ask us, like, what should you get rid of? Or, is this useful or not? Or, I mean, as you said, nobody's fully prepared to answer that question. So our answer was to produce those types of tools where you can see this worked for this specific reason. And not only for this reason, but it had these implications. So understanding sort of like what each plan, project, reference is successful at, and just understanding it better helps to know when you can use it as a reference or not. Just giving them that information helped, because sometimes it's like, oh, super successful, like Highline. Wow, everyone wants to go to the Highline in New York, but it has all of these implications and like gentrification, and it was like a bottom-up process. But if you ask the population that was living there, it's like failure. It's not even for them anymore. They wanted like a courtyard, and they wanted like different things. They don't have what they asked for in the beginning. Obviously, for the city is a super success. So success, failure are not generalized. So we always ask this ourselves, like, who's this being resilient for? And when? Because also that population might change. It's easy to say, for a smaller population, this became very relevant when we talk about Phoenix or like DC area or whatever. It's like, let's see if it's scalable to that, So just having that information laid out helps at least to go look for the people who know more about a certain topic and ask their own, and having more and more discussion tables. But you need to synthesize what comes out of those tables. Otherwise, it's just people blabbing and talking. You need to be able to put it into words, to put it into a drawing, to say, are we all, agreeing that this is what's the conclusion of this? And then go to another one and test it again and going back. It's a very long process, as she was saying earlier. It's a super long process sometimes, but if you have these tools, then you can make decisions faster in the future, because at least you know a bit better what you're expecting. I would say it makes you more adaptable. Yeah, I think maybe this one. Sorry.
And the rebuild back attack that the EPA.
Oh, you know very much more than me. Yeah, it was pretty criticized, and the projects were as well. Like, who's doing these projects? And they're going for the prices and not necessarily what's needed. And I mean, it's very interesting to see that with Sandy, one of the most resilient communities was one that did not receive this aid. What's the name of it? Red Hook, which was already very well organized. So you need to take into account what's already happening there, because if you know your neighbor, you can help him. If you don't know your neighbor, you don't know their needs, you don't know your strengths, you don't know your, then it's very tough to know them when there's like when there's the disaster taking place. And that's not something easy to input into the system, but it's definitely very relevant. And that's why history also helps to understand where are those communities and learn from them before it hits. So being proactive that way also helps.
Driving.
Who's driving the bullet? Without it, I know that, I mean, only Mirabai, like only peripheral communities can actually thrive no matter who's in charge, because they don't need them. That's what's interesting. You can learn from them because it's a process where they don't need the government. Their government has been on their side for a while, and they just don't want them to come in anymore, because they build their own universities, clinics, libraries. So like, we can run them. You won't do this to us. This takes too much money and effort from us. They work every Saturday for their communities. So, it's almost as time is more expensive for them than to me. When, Saturdays I'm probably watching Netflix or something. And them, it's their community building time, so their hour costs way more than mine on a Saturday, for sure. So it's just weighing in and knowing what to look at even these peripheral areas where, they don't, the RCC program is very interesting, because we are set up, we're a part of this network where, Phoenix is a part of it, Tempe, New York, Houston, Toronto, and Iztapalapa, which is like, oh my God, like they had no idea what they did when they invited us in Iztapalapa. And Miravalle is like, what? I get to go to New York. I've never left Iztapalapa, like, okay, let's go learn. And it's very interesting to see what Houston learned from. They were super thankful to their perspective in one way that to me was very like interesting. Houston was like demanding the government to do things for them. And Iztapalapa was telling them, why do you do that? Why do you give them the power to do that? You're helping them actually if and that's tendency around the world. No government can take care of all of the needs of the population while facing climate change. There's no government that will be able to address that. So it's time to learn from those that have never trusted the government, have never relied on them. There's a lot of things to be learned there that Houston was like, oh, I never thought about like an open plan and like a process and not a plan. Like we never thought that was something that we could do. And like, what's stopping you, And I don't know, there's a lot of like exchange of experiences that you don't foresee, but when they happen, it's really enriching. And so she was first, and then maybe you.
Yeah, we take those two.
Yeah. Then we move on. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for your time and your insight. Honestly, it's been really fruitful. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more on your experience with community engagement, and you kind of talked a little bit about that heat index map when you showed them that. Then that kind of became like an event where they then started to engage more with participation and everything. So do you think, like, essentially, what do you think motivated that? Like, was it the vividness of the map? Was it the information it was delivering? Like, what made that specific moment be like the moment where then the communities like took the power to then be like, okay, I'm ready to participate?
Yeah, it was more about the discussion around it because when they saw the heat map and they saw that certain areas that had parks were doing better, it meant that they could have a better, you know, performance, climatically speaking, if they protected their parks and they procure them in certain ways, or they use certain species instead of others. And so just having that information of how near you need to be of a park to have that behavior, they're like, oh, we can like, let's just like push for this. Let's go for it. Let's get this park like greener and let's get this thing done. And it was just empowering for them to see how other parts of the cities were reacting to greenery, and that it's something that you don't need much to do if you know what you're doing, and that they had certain spaces that they could take advantage of. That was very, like, in terms of the heat map, that was what was like, well, we can be like that,
Thank you.
anyway. Yeah, thanks. Who will start?
Yeah, I just want to echo sort of what others have said in terms of incredible presentation. Really enjoyed it. You got after my initial question in terms of even in my own work, communities are increasingly interested in moving beyond diagnostics to actual transformation. And I think you answered that question in terms of the community specifically in Mexico that you're working with are actually taking ownership of that transformation, which is interesting. But I'm wondering too, is like, what have you learned in some of the comparisons between maybe an unincorporated rural area in Mexico that probably can take ownership of that transformation a little bit more than maybe a inner city neighborhood on the east end of Houston, which navigating permits and the legal requirements to actually do brick and mortar changes are very different than that of a unincorporated area, even in Texas. Like we think, I don't, I'm sure you know about the colonias, right? Along that Texas-Mexico border, even taking ownership of infrastructure, um, in that area is very different than doing it in the urban core of Houston. And so just wondering, what are your thoughts in terms of different opportunities for taking ownership of transformation between the areas that you study? But then also too, something that I've, sort of dealt with in my work is that, you know, it's a hell of a thing to ask folks who have 1 and 2 real jobs, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, to then ask them on Saturdays to do more work that they're not being compensated for just to survive, whereas other communities get that just by birthright. And just wondering, like, I've been conflicted about that in my own work in terms of participation and doing infrastructures. Like, it's a hell of a thing, right? To require people to do that extra labor just to get their basic needs met when other communities again get it by default.
Yeah, totally. Those are very tough questions to address overall. I think obviously there's different opportunities within different contexts and ownership levels. Um, but what I see is that you can also foster that kind of ownership in different contexts as well, but through different means, because one is more like a survival mode, in terms of like, if you don't work on Saturdays, then there's no water on Monday. So definitely working on Saturday for the community. They don't even see it as work. They see it as because that's also a definition of like the modern city, work. That's what you get to get some food on the table and get your basic needs taken care of. But for them, Saturdays is not work. It's where they feel comfortable. It's where they have fun while working, while doing all this, projects. And it's as if you're like cleaning your house. Is that work? Well, for some it is. But it's just like the way we frame what we do. It just goes beyond your home, and your home becomes your district, your school, your, sidewalks. And it's just switching that. conceptual lens, towards different things. When we were working in Tacubaya, that's a completely different context because a lot of people pass through it. So it's very hard to have ownership if you're just going by, like you're not stopping, you don't care about that space. So how to generate that ownership becomes very relevant. You have to make it visible. And that's where design has an opportunity. Urban design, urbanism, you have a chance to make a difference and to tell people. In Mexico, we do certain things like put a Virgin Mary in the corners, and then people won't leave their trash there, because how are you going to leave like trash near the Virgin Mary? And it's a strategy. Maybe they don't even believe in the Virgin Mary, but they put it there, and then it's like, people behave differently. So you need to find your own pros, your own things that people react to. And it's not impossible. The subway, for instance, in Mexico City, like it's super, congested. They just placed those arrows in the floor, and people started behaving differently. It's so cheap. It's just paint on the floor. And people sort of like went like, oh, that's all I needed. Thank you. It's so cheap. And it's just testing things out. I think tactical urbanism helps in that way, to test things out and learn from it, observe, evaluate, monitor, go back, and then spend the big bucks on it before doing it, because then you're like building successes. And it's about who you invite to do the project, because if you do the project, you care for it. If you're not involved and you're just asking the government to do something for you, it becomes just like a complaint. And basically, maybe it gets done in certain places, but when those complaints get too large, pretty sure they won't get done, because there's no government that can deal with all of the needs. I'm not seeing it anywhere, even in the Western world. It's not happening. So how do we help? We need to help, but like not necessarily. I don't agree that people need to build their own infrastructure. That should not be their task. But what is, and how we force government to do the task that citizens should not be doing. And we all hold a place in the ecosystem. So making it first like visible those needs, visible that ecosystem, helps to understand where opportunities lie. That's what I would say. It's not a direct like response to your question, but okay. Thank you. Thank you.